Hi, it's Mike Stephenson here. In today's video, we're going to talk about the new release of Serverless 360, where we've introduced support for Power Automate flows. So if we think about the background to Serverless 360, so we're trying to solve this problem where people build solutions with Azure, and it's difficult for the business users and support team to participate in the support of the solution. And the result of that is all of the support tickets and the support requirements would always escalate to a developer and a Azure expert over here on the side. And I think with Power Platform, we also find a similar thing where it's not that easy for a support person to provide support for Power Automate flows, which is one of the reasons we've introduced support for Power Platform. So really that would sit over here, and we have the same problem where the developer is going to be doing support of the solution in Power Platform. So with Serverless 360, we've got four modules. We've got business applications, which is aimed at the support operator being able to provide support of the technical components in your solution. So we're going to be talking about that today and the introduction of Power Automate inside business applications. We'll be able to manage a Power Automate flow side by side with an Azure asset, which we think would commonly be used in a solution that you might build. We'll also be talking about business activity monitoring, which is aimed at providing business self-service and an abstracted view on top of the technical components so you could see the business function that's executing. We also have two other modules which we won't be covering today down at the bottom. So one of them is about cost analysis for your Azure spend, and the other is about automation of documentation. So we've got loads of videos on YouTube and other platforms about how those features work, but today we'll be focusing on these two up at the top. The result we want to get is by pushing support left with these two modules, we can then free up the developers and the Azure experts over here so they can focus on building new solutions and new value being delivered for the business. We'll allow support people to manage and monitor the technical components via the business applications down here, which is the first component. And then the second component, BAM, that'll allow the support operators and business users to self-service and manage those business transactions so you can manage the processing of an order versus manage the technical component that implements it. So we think about where people use Power Automate. So first off, we've got a typical architecture for an enterprise integration customer. So they've got lots of Azure assets, things like logic apps, API management, and other things. And sometimes you'll see an integration customer uses Power Automate down here if they want to implement some kind of human workflow. So it would be common that if maybe you have a logic app integration that needs an approval process, you might call out to Power Automate, utilize the approvals, and then call back into your system workflows would be a good example of that. We also see a number of other use cases. So we've got Power Platform application development. So the Power Platform has a whole bunch of different services available depending on the kind of app that you build. So really, you're going to be building things like model-driven apps, dynamics type applications. And what you tend to find, although those apps are really based a lot around the Dataverse, you tend to bring in parts of the other ecosystem, both in Power Platform and inside Azure. So if we take things like the Power Platform, so it's common you might have an ETL requirement, so you want data flows. You often have Power Virtual Agent, RPA, and things like Power Automate. So this is the one we're going to be talking about today. It's not uncommon that you see a customer might need something like an API, a service bus in the Azure space, and things like a function. We'll also be looking a little bit at functions today in the example. So that would be a typical architecture you might find a Power Platform customer using if they're building quite big systems of Power Platform. Now, we also have other scenarios where you might have either a department, let's say the HR department builds their own solution with Power Automate to do some in-team automation, or maybe you have a person who develops their own automation to automate part of their job. So in this case, this is where we'll typically see Power Automate flag up here because they might be doing some automation of SharePoint and Teams or something like that. So we can see here there's like at least 3, but probably other um, reference architectures customers might be implementing where Power Automate is part of that ecosystem. So I think there's a good scenario for people who might need to enhance the monitoring and management, because we think that at the moment Power Platform makes it challenging for customers. So what we'll do is we'll look at an example architecture here. So what I've developed is, maybe in the past you've seen my truck tracker demos where we've got a lot of integration solutions into Dataverse. And here my department wants an automation that will export the recent trucks that have been processed and just put it into a storage account so they can do something with it. Let's imagine it might be exporting to Excel or something like that. Now, this is a good case for building a Power Automate. It might be part of the Dataverse solution. So you might say, right, let's build a simple trigger here. This is going to go and get data from the Dataverse. They may need a developer to help transform the data. Maybe the Dataverse format's not that friendly, so they might want to write an Azure function down here. They call from the Power Automate flow via API management to the function, transform the data, and then they'd use a connector to deliver it to storage or SharePoint or whatever. It's actually, I think in my demo, I think it's SharePoint. So I'll just update that. Okay, now there's 2 ways I can use this flow. So what I've deliberately done here is I've done this as an HTTP trigger. And what I can do is have a second flow that manages the schedule. So let's say this flow runs on a nightly basis and it triggers this one to go and do the export, so that there's a file gets produced every night. But one of the great things about Power Platform and the way it integrates with Teams is we could also use a Power Virtual Agent down here, so that a user in Teams can interact with a chatbot and they can just request that the export gets run. So maybe you want to have like an on-demand run of the Power Automate flow. So that's quite a good way of utilizing virtual agents inside Teams to trigger an automation. So that would be how we do that. Now, the first question, we've got a lot of stuff going on here. So the question is, how do we manage and monitor this? So often these things will be built as as like part of an application development or maybe a departmental solution. And you've got things in Azure, you've got things in the Power Platform. In my demo case, actually, I've got 2 different Power Platform environments because my truck tracker data is in one environment, but my Teams is in a different environment. So I've got some challenges there. Now, this is where Serverless 360 can help you a lot, because we can bring in things from different resource groups and subscriptions in Azure and things from different Power Platform environments and manage them in one place. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to take my API management, my Azure function, and I'm going to add them to my business app. And then I'm going to take these 2 Power Automate flows, and I'm also going to add them to the same business app. And then I'm going to basically manage them as one chunk. Now let's take a look and see how that gets implemented. Over here in our Power Platform environment, so I've got my export recent trucks automation here. So if we open that up and we can take a look at it, so you see I've got an HTTP trigger to receive a request to start the flow, and then I've got an error handling block. So this comes into play on the BAM implementation a bit more, but we'll come to that in the second demo. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kick the flow off. I'll do a list rows, so I'll go and get some data from Dataverse. And then here I'm going to call out to my transform truck extract. So that calls out to API management, which forwards the request to a function where I've got some C# code that transforms the data. I'll get the response data back, and then I'm going to create a file in SharePoint with that SharePoint data. So I've got 2 things after this. The first one is the scheduling. So if we go back to my flows, you can see I've got my export recent truck schedule. So this is pretty simple flow where I'm just getting the call back for the child flow and I'm triggering it over HTTP. I think my Power Automate knowledge might need a little bit of updating here. I'm sure there's another connector you can call it directly, but I think because it's a recurrence trigger, I'm not seeing that. But either way, that'll get the URL and then I can just trigger it over HTTP. And that'll let me run a nightly schedule to trigger my extract. Now, the next thing is the truck tracker bot. So over in my Teams environment, you can see I've got my truck tracker bot here, and I can go into my Power Virtual Agents, and in the truck tracker, I've got my my bot here, and this basically has a bunch of topics. So this export recent trucks topic is the one that I can trigger with the phrase export recent trucks. That'll just send a confirmation in Teams that I can that I'm triggering this flow, and then this is going to call a Power Automate, which lives in the second Dataverse environment, which is where this virtual agent is, and all that does is it does a call across to the other environment and triggers the flow that we've just looked at, and then I'll confirm that I've got a response from that trigger. Now, if I want to run this, so in my Teams here, you'll see I've got my truck tracker bot, and I can just use this key phrase here, and I can say, right, go and run the export. So we get back a response from the bot saying, thanks, we're going to run it, and there's the response from the flow that it was a 200. Now we should see over here, we should see a run that's just happened, so 15 seconds ago. And if we look at the run history, we can see this kicked off. We get the data from Dataverse, transform it, create the SharePoint files. This is all really good. Now, let's take a look at Serverless 360 and the questions about how do we manage this solution now that we've got this up and running. So what I can do in my business applications, so if you take a start on the home page, we've got the 4 modules here, and I can go into my business applications. I've created an area for any Power Platform applications that we're building. So I've got my recent truck exports here, and you can see that I've already got some resources here. So you can see that I've got an API management operation, which is the one for the transformation. I've got an Azure function where that basically gets the call forwarded from API management to execute the transformation. I've got my Power Automate flow, so I've got my export recent trucks. Now, what we'll do is I'll just show adding the scheduler flow, just so you can see what happens. So in my Power Platform, I would choose a service principal that I've got configured. So we'll do a separate video about how to configure this service principal, because it's slightly different on the security side of things than it is for Azure. But with Serverless 360, we've tried to abstract that to make it easy. So once you've got the service principal, you'll be able to see what's in your environment. So I've got my connected systems model-driven environment here, and I can go down and say, right, I'll have my Power Automate flows, and I'm going to add this scheduler one. You'll see that's now been added to my application. So I've got both of these. You can see all the different types of resource here that make up my app. Now, if we go and have a look at some of the features inside the Power Automate flow, so we've tried to make this as similar to our Logic app features as we can, because obviously they're very similar technologies. There's a couple of subtle differences, so we haven't really got the metrics available in the same way we do for Logic apps. There's a little bit of a difference on the main screen. In Logic apps, we'd have all the dashboards here, but we get the run history, so I can go and see all of the runs for each of these flows, and I can open it up and see the run history here, and I can do all the things I could do with Logic apps to see the details of each action and stuff like that. I can see the trigger history here, so I can see each time it's been fired. We have the action required tab, the same as we do for Logic apps. So if you had a flow that ran and got an error, it would show up as an action required, and then you can either resubmit or ignore it. We've got some of the management operations like disable and run trigger, resubmit failed runs, that kind of thing at the top. You can favorite a run. So over here in my run history, I can mark it as a favorite, and I can easily find that if I'm troubleshooting it later on. And then finally, we've got the monitoring. So you can configure two things. You can configure the state. So if I have a one that's not equal to started, I'll get an error. And then if I have the failed runs, if I have any, like if I have one failure since we last checked, I'll get a warning. And if we have more than one, I'll get an error. So we'll implement some checking of the run history to see if there's been any errors, and that'll basically fire exactly like your Azure alerts do in Serverless 360. So it would trigger this application to go into an unhealthy state. It would flag up red a bit like some of these above. That would trigger your notifications. So you maybe have a ServiceNow notification or an email, and everything after that is just like you get for Azure for Serverless 360. Your Power Automates will also show up in things like the service map over here. So you'll be able to see, if I click on here, I can see that my failed runs are 0, my state started, so I'm good. And that's really what we've got in business applications at this point. It's really a case of getting customers into using it, finding they get the value from the monitoring and the management, and then we'll add more features over time, and we'd love feedback on what people think and what features they'd like to see us add to business applications. Okay, so that was the business applications. Now we're going to take a look at business activity monitoring. So previously on the last demo, we were looking at how you would manage the technical components in that architecture. So how you manage the Power Automate flows, how you manage the functions. Now what we want to do is go up a level, a higher abstraction, and we want to manage the export process. So what we want to do now is create a view that, let's say our support operators would have to be a little bit technical to manage the components, and they can have monitoring driven by the technical solution. But what about if we want to have business self-service can go and check when the runs have happened? They can go and check for some of the data or something like that. So this is where we can leverage the business activity monitoring feature in Serverless 360. So what we could do, if we imagine in this Power Automate, we can add actions. So we may maybe add an action at the start and an action at the end. And the idea is we would send an event from the Power Automate flow to Serverless 360 and tell it about what's going on. So this is where we would be saying, we've got this export routine, here's the type it is, here's where we are in this process, and we'd have a friendly view to be able to track that business function. Now let's take a look at what that would look like. Back over in the Serverless 360 portal, so I'm now in the business activity monitoring area, and I'm down in my transport business processes down here. So I've created a truck tracker exports process, and I've defined a couple of transactions here. So you can see the export recent trucks. It's a pretty simple process. There's a few steps in that Power Automate flow, but really from a sort of self-service for the business super user, they don't care about all the detail of what's in the flow. They just want to know, did it start and did it work? So in my my diagram here, you can see I've got two steps: the process started, process completed. I've configured some properties, so I've defined the source and target systems, and I've defined the workflow ID and name, which I'm going to get from the Power Automate flow. So that'll give us a simple view. So over in the tracking area, we'll be able to see the details of the jobs that have been run. So I've got a simple view at the top here where I've created columns for the file name, for the source system, the target systems. These are common ones that business users find useful when they want to see what integrations are happening. So they get that it's data extracted from Dataverse to SharePoint. In the demo, the file name's static, but if you had a different file name each day or something, that might make it easy to see which one they're looking at here. And they can then, when they see the one they want, they can click on it, it'll open up, and they'll be to see the steps that happened. So if there was some kind of error, one of these steps might show red, and you might tell it the error message that you want them to do something, so they can go and potentially there's just a data issue. There's not really a problem with the code or anything. So you could click these steps. You could, if you've shared a message with BAM, you could show them the message here if you wanted to. So sometimes the user might want to see a CSV file or an XML message or something like that. You can see here I've actually just sent the details of the Power Automate flow, and I've actually used that to promote the workflow ID and name, which you'll see down here. And really, it's from the BAM side, it's pretty much that simple, just to create this track and trace type view. We then have all the features like action required if there's been any failures. So you can manage resubmitting them if you wanted to resubmit, or you could ignore them if you knew it was sorted out some other way and it fixed the next day. You can do favorites and assignments. You get dashboard capability, so you'll get an out-of-the-box dashboard telling you a bit about what's happened. You can customize the dashboard up here and add your own widgets based on queries that you might write. So if you had a custom query you wrote in the tracking area, you can use that to drive a widget in the dashboards. You would define your transactions over here. So this is really like the tracking view of what you want the business user or the support user to see. And then finally, we've got the monitoring where you would have any support incidents over here. You can do things like track duration. So if you've got a long running process, you can alert if it takes too long. You can alert on exceptions, or you can write queries. So if things like if you want to say, we expect at least one run per 24 hours, you can do that kind of query here and raise alerts from that. Those are the features that BAM opens up for creating like a higher level abstraction to manage your Power Automate flows. Now, how you would use that in the in Power Automate. So if we go over here, you can see that I've defined a connector which uses the OpenAPI spec from Serverless 360. So I then would pass in some information. So you can see I pass in my business process. So obviously, look, it's the truck tracker exports. It's the recent truck transaction. I supply the stage that maps to the shape on the diagram, and I can supply a message body, a header, and I can have other properties like, do you want to archive the message? Was the stage successful? And likewise, when I get to do an update, so later on I would say, this is now complete. Here's the update. In this case, I've passed the output from the SharePoint connector, so it'll tell me which file got created in SharePoint. And if there was an error, this is where I've used the catch block down here, so I could supply things like information about the error or what I want the support person to do, or whatever error handling you want to put. But that opens up that feature for people to see a simple view of what's going on without having to worry about which Dataverse environment it's in. Many companies end up with like 10, 15 environments nowadays. Is not uncommon. You're not worried about which Azure components are involved. You're just looking in one central place where you can manage the business abstraction of, here I've got my EDI process and all of my logic app integrations, and these are some of these are data factories, and this one here is my truck tracker documents. Also, they're Power Automate based automations. So having that single view, I think, is something customers will find really valuable. Okay, so hopefully we saw how you could make management of the solution even easier. We've pushed support left 2 times now, once for the technical components and next for the business functionality. So hopefully that gives you a really good overview of the new features we've added in Serverless 360 to enhance the support of a solution that could either just be a Power Platform solution on its own by managing your Power Automate flows, or it could be a hybrid solution combining Power Platform and Azure, so you can manage those services both in one place. What we'd love to hear from customers is hopefully you'd recognise that this feature is quite valuable and you would like to try it out. Come and give us a shout if you want to have a chat about that. What we'd love to hear, though, is what other features do we need in Serverless 360 to give a great management experience for Power Platform. Maybe we want to add other kinds of flows. So we've got things like desktop flows. Maybe we want to add some of them Power Platform data flows. They're a bit like our data factory features, so we could do something similar to that. I think there's a lot more we could do with this ecosystem, but hopefully this is a really helpful feature we've added, and thank you very much for listening to our video today.